Hello there. It's been quite a while since we've spoken. How are you doing? It's good to see you again. I have been extremely busy these past 3 months since the end of the 92 Days project myself. I've been focusing on a ton of schoolwork, starting a new major for the third time, so we'll see how that goes. And as nice as it is to be back in person instead of online, everything I said in my 3-part series on American universities still definitely rings true. And not a day goes by when I don't think about it. Anyway, before we get into our Thanksgiving Day special episode, there are a few things I've got to get through. Firstly, I've noticed an interesting trend in my videos that I was entirely unaware of until just weeks ago. I never thought that my most viewed video up to this point would be on Batman, but I cannot express exactly how happy that makes the little kid in my soul. If you would like me to make more Batman-related video essays, please let me know. I've got plenty to talk about in that regard, and it would make me more than happy to do so. Second, I'm not entirely sure how stable or consistent my content will be now that I'm back in school, for better or worse. I've almost completed this semester with only 3 more weeks of classes to go, and I've got to focus on finishing strong. However, I've got at least 1 more video essay planned for the year, and it'll be our Christmas special, so stay tuned for a wonderful holiday tale. Thirdly, if that's how you'd say it, I'm working on pre-production of a couple of new series ideas rolling around in my head. In fact, the tiny set I'm building for it is built in the corner of my basement specifically for these 2 series. Again, stay tuned. Finally, it means the world to me that all of you have watched and stayed with my content for however long you've been here, and I'm extremely grateful for your viewership. If you feel like supporting me with more than that viewership, you can go and head on over to Patreon and support me for as little as $1 per month, or head on over to my merch shop at cnp-productions.com/store. I still have all of my 92 Days merch up there, and my plan is still to release 1 type of themed merchandise with each video. Again, thank you so much for watching. It means the world to me. And now, without further ado, let's begin the amazing true story of the first Thanksgiving. I know it's a meme to say this, but it's true nonetheless. We live in a society where everyone is looking to be offended about everything at all given times. In fact, we've gotten so good at it that now we will be offended for other people, and will go so far as to tell them that they should be offended by the actions, ideas, and concepts that they may never have considered offensive in the first place. In fact, proactive offense has become so popular that it has become an integral and mandatory portion of the American education system at all levels and practically all disciplines. And that's not the most idiotic portion of it yet. No, we can even take one of the most important examples of overcoming differences for the sake of a common good, coming together in a time of need and living alongside one another as equals, and allow that story to be corrupted into a fable about the horrors of racism and genocide. A crash course on how to pin all of the ills of history upon one group of people without ever understanding the irony of that ideology. But rather than get into the full breadth of that discussion here, I'll save that for another day, or rather another series that I've been cooking up for a while. Today, in honor of one of the first 4 national holidays in the United States, I wish to give you the full, complete history of Thanksgiving, a holiday designed around the core idea of unity, and I am going to prove that to you. In 1517, only 25 years after Christopher Columbus completed his first voyage to the New World, a Catholic monastic priest named Martin Luther would stand up in the face of the most powerful organized religious force in Europe and declare his protest and dispute with what he saw to be the direct sacrilegious practices enforced by the Roman Catholic Church. nailing his list of no less than 95 claims of sacrilegious and theologically dishonest practices to the door of the Castle Church in his hometown of Wittenberg, Germany, where he was a professor of moral theology at the local university. He set off a chain reaction that would soon come to divide the entire continent on the grounds of whether you were Roman Catholic or a Protestant Christian. Over the years, these different wars would be fought between practically any two European nations with disparate beliefs on the matter of which Christianity was the better form of Christianity. In fact, even the same country would change their stance depending on which monarch was in charge at the time. Eventually, though, the major contenders that would come to command the body politic of religious expression would be defined. France, Spain, and Portugal would stand by the old Orthodox guard of Roman Catholicism, with England and what would become the United Kingdom as standard bearers for the new Protestant cause, is where our story truly begins. On April 21st in 1509, a young Henry Tudor, just under 18 years old at the time, would succeed his newly deceased father and become Henry VIII. And from that moment on, history was forever changed. On June 11th of that same year, he would quietly marry Catherine, the youngest child of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I of Spain, in an effort to not only redeem the widowed wife of his elder brother Arthur, but to firmly secure an alliance between their two nations. On the 23rd of that month, Henry would lead the now 23-year-old Catherine from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey for their coronation, which would take place the following morning. As Catherine would write to her father Ferdinand, "Our time is spent in continuous festival." However, neither theirs nor any of Henry's 6 marriages would end happily. Over the course of the next several decades, one of Henry's concerns outside of conflicts with France and religious contention within his own country was to find a way to divorce his wives that would not, and in some cases could not, bear him sons without the involvement of the Pope. In 1534, though, Henry would be sick of his search. The Church of England would separate entirely from Rome. While various theological arguments can be made for this change being inevitable, as we can see with many different movements happening in the English Church at the time, there is no doubt that it was largely inspired by Henry's drive to divorce the wives of his he believed to be unfit. Henry would continue to dissolve the old church in England with the dissolution of monasteries from 1534 to 1540, disbanding many monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries throughout all of England, Wales, and Ireland to assimilate their wealth and lands to be sold in an effort to fund his military engagements with various European nations. Mostly, though, France. G.W. Bernard, a British historian specializing in Henry VIII's reign, the English Reformation, as well as Anne Boleyn, argues, "The dissolution of the monasteries in the late 1530s was one of the most revolutionary events in English history. There were nearly 900 religious houses in England, around 260 for monks, 300 for regular canons, 142 nunneries, and 183 friaries, some 12,000 people in total, with 4,000 monks, 3,000 canons, 3,000 friars, and 2,000 nuns. One adult man in 50 was in religious orders." Though the English Reformation would put an end to many Catholic institutions in England, Henry would remain a devout Catholic by his own admission. It would not be until Elizabeth I and the Elizabethan settlement that the Church would find a middle ground between Catholic and Protestant practices and rulings. Even at this, there were many religious sects and denominations of Protestants unsatisfied with the rather limited extent of the English Reformation and the Elizabethan settlement. Most importantly, especially for our story today, is that of the Puritans. Unlike the tainted image of being the standard for conservative and traditional values, specifically to the point of restrictive and harmful measures designed to dull and limit the reach of individuality, the name Puritan was derived from the sect's desire to further purify the practices of the Anglican Church. The Puritan movement of the 16th and 17th centuries was originally formed as a group petitioning to further separate England and her church from Roman Catholic influence and practices, many of which the group held as sacrilegious and antithetical to Christian beliefs. Into the 17th century, the Puritan movement would be largely split into two factions, the Standards and the Independents. Independents, also known as separatists, and sadly no, not the ones from Star Wars, would argue that instead of reforming the Anglican Church, they should do away with it altogether and form a new, completely Protestant institution instead. However, due to their religious persecution in the early part of the 17th century, the separatists would largely leave for the New World in order to practice freely. Landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620, these pilgrims and other settlers, mainly adventurers and tradesmen, which they had picked up during their relatively short stint in Holland, would create a codified system of rules, a governing document to live by in their new Plymouth colony, known today as the Mayflower Compact. Named after the ship they traveled in, this Mayflower Compact, more so than almost any other document up till this point in history, would be a direct ancestor to the United States Declaration of Independence, as well as the Constitution. Personally, I highly recommend you go back and read it at your leisure for a more in-depth understanding. Upon its signing, a group of pilgrims and prospectors would stake their claim in Cape Cod and begin again. When these pilgrims had first arrived in Cape Cod in November of 1620, they had encountered substantially few, if any, American Indians, having been decimated by both the plague of 1618 and 1619, and having been largely distrustful of Europeans due to terrible interactions with French traders in the north. The region was largely unpopulated. The Neises, which were the first tribe encountered by the pilgrims, were initially skeptical of the newcomers, and it's recorded that there was initial conflict before contact could be officially made. Though musket fire and arrows were exchanged, it's been recorded that neither side experienced any casualties. In fact, upon their initial landing, they had been found short of all food stores and would take from an underground supply of dried corn, vowing to one day repay these stolen goods. In less than a year, that repayment would come in full. While they were there, they would desecrate what was believed to be a burial ground, and it is believed to have been done in an effort to establish the wealth of the region, but would do all they could to restore these sites and, as recorded in their own journals, attempt to replace everything exactly as it was in an effort to repent for this affront. Shortly after, the pilgrims would move on to Plymouth Harbor, where they would lay down their roots. The location was originally an Indian village that had been decimated by the earlier plague and left completely abandoned, with Squanto, a Nauset, being recorded as the sole survivor of that village. Squanto would later travel with a group of these new settlers back to England. As we can see, rather than the popular idea that pilgrims had stolen and slaughtered for the lands they took, they made every single effort to live separately and in peace with those who already existed. The pilgrims in no way seized the land from the Nauset Indians of the region. Almost all of it had been deserted due to the disease that had ravaged the region. In 1620, it's estimated that there were under 20,000 American Indians that had lived in the New England region, with numbers hovering anywhere from about 15,000 to 18,000 at most. Later, the smallpox epidemic of 1633 to 1634 would significantly reduce the Indian population from their already staggeringly low numbers. Following these, it is clear that most American Indians in the region would be more than happy to trade land to the pilgrims in exchange for tools and other European luxuries that were in abundance amongst these settlers. In their first year, the Pilgrims had their numbers extensively reduced due to their first winter. It's estimated that only around 50 of the original ship would survive. In the following March of 1621, the Puritans would meet Samoset, sent from the Wampanoags, in order to establish trade and friendly relations between the two groups. Squanto, who had returned by this point, would come to the second meeting and become the chief translator between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag chief Massasoit. Within a year, Pilgrims had peaceful relations with most of the surrounding tribes and a stable alliance with the Wampanoags against their enemy, the Narragansetts. The Wampanoags were particularly grateful after one incident where Squanto and other tribesmen had been kidnapped by the Narragansetts, and the Pilgrims were swift in their recovery. It's even recorded that there was very minimal bloodshed in this recovery process. A year later, in 1622, the first ever Thanksgiving was recorded. An estimated 90 Wampanoags and the remaining 50 Pilgrims would come together for a feast and celebrate the harvest. Now, while it's popular today to think that turkey would not have been on the menu, it's recorded otherwise. Edward Winslow would state that we ate fowl, and William Bradford records that there were a great store of wild turkeys. Besides this, just to make my mouth water, they served venison, fish, and corn. While the celebration would not become annual, we do have a record of another happening 2 years later in Plymouth. Despite the general unity, not all would be calm. Squanto would try to use his position as translator in an attempt to overthrow Massasoit as chief, and the Wampanoags would demand Squanto's head. However, the Pilgrims defended him as he had proven to be a necessary part of living in the colony as their translator. Bradford, governor of the colony at the time, was about to give in to Massasoit's demands, but records that a ship was spotted off the coast and ended the need for negotiations. While Massasoit did not push the point after this, Squanto would remain with the Pilgrims for his own safety. While the Plymouth colony would remain on good terms with the surrounding American Indian tribes, another colony, the Wessagussets, which were begun by the aforementioned ship spotted off of the coast, would be an entirely different story. This colony, landing just north of Plymouth, would prove to be very troublesome for all around them, routinely stealing supplies and crops like corn. While trust for the settlers in general would begin to wane, the Plymouth colony would regain the Wampanoags' trust when Edward Winslow provided medical care for the gravely ill Chief Massasoit, allowing him to regain his strength, after which Massasoit is recorded to have said this of the Plymouth colony: "Now I see the English are my friends and love me, and whilst I live, I will never forget this kindness they have showed me." He would return the favor by warning them of a plot to destroy both colonies and would provide his aid against such. By this time, the Wessagusset colony had mostly been dissolved and either joined with Plymouth or placed themselves in servitude of the surrounding Indian tribes. However, there were still whispers of a multi-tribal coalition planning to attack Plymouth, so the settlers, alongside men from the Wampanoags, would direct a preemptive strike against the lead conspirator, Chief Witawamet, and several other tribal leaders. Taking no firearms and only using the silent weapons of the native Wampanoags, Witawamet and 2 other leaders would be assassinated. After this, his head was taken to Plymouth and placed on a spike at their fort. And even after avoiding potential catastrophe, John Robinson, the Puritan pastoral leader of the Plymouth colony, would admonish the men for their hasty resort to violence. Regardless, this preemptive strike provided ample reason for the multi-tribal coalition to keep from attacking either the Plymouth colony or the Wampanoags, and further solidified the bond between these two. Over the years, veritable legions of Puritans would begin to swell up in this region, and by 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, just north of Plymouth now, would become the dominant colonial power in the region. From this point on, officials from Boston would oversee most, if not all, affairs with the surrounding Indian tribes, and by 1637, the Bay Colony had an estimated 8,000 residents, with an estimated total of 20,000 living in the greater New England region. By this time, the tribes of the region had been decimated by the smallpox epidemic of 1633 to 1634, and there is no doubt that this disease spread from the New England colonists, largely unaffected at the time. However, to blame these colonies for spreading this is exceedingly futile and petty. Germ theory would not even begin to develop for another 200 years and wouldn't be accepted until the 20th century as scientific fact. There is no possible way that these pilgrims would have known that viruses they had lived with and grown largely accustomed to would be the death of tens of thousands of people around them previously unexposed. What we historically understand about Puritan expansion was that it was by and large peaceful in nature, contrary to what you might be taught in today's corrupt educational system. Historian Alden Vaughan, professor of history at Clark University and a specialist in 17th century English colonial America, states, quote, "One of the most persistent myths concerning the relations between the Puritan settlers and the American Indians asserts that the colonists robbed the native of his land. Such a view is no longer held by those reasonably well acquainted with the history of early New England." As previously stated, the two plagues of 1616 and 1633 had decimated the native populations of North America. As such, the surrounding tribes found themselves with far more land than they knew what to do with, or necessarily could even utilize. Contrary to popular belief, the tribes would actually approach these early settlers and trade that untenable land for valuable tools and luxury goods from the colonies, whose quality and quantity were lacking among the tribes. Even better, from the thousands of surviving deeds we have on record, a vast majority of them show measures allowing for the native tribes to continue to hunt, fish, and sometimes even cultivate crops on this sold land. The General Court of Connecticut in 1649 would go so far as to declare, "For no Indians are deprived of that liberty in any of our towns, provided that they do it not upon the Sabbath day." And Roger William would write in his text titled A Key into the Languages of America that, quote, "It is a sinful opinion amongst many that Christians have a right to heathen lands." Instead, it was actually taught that land needed to be purchased, not stolen or taken by force. Similarly, it was also unlikely that these Indians did not understand the implications of selling and trading land to the Puritan colonies. Roger Williams and Edward Winslow would account that the natives understood the boundaries of what was and was not their territory. Williams would even write that, quote, "I have known them to make bargain and sale amongst themselves for a small piece or quantity of ground." We similarly have no documented instance of the various tribes of the New England region believing that all land was communally owned by all people, but rather both understood and personally practiced land ownership. Chiefs, which were called sachems, would divide the land they owned amongst the tribe and were more than willing to sell unlived and untenable land to the settlers in exchange for tools, luxury goods, and weapons. A beneficial transaction on both fronts, these tribes often saw the Puritans as powerful allies against the tribes they were enemies with. Allowing and even promoting that Puritans with their muskets should move into their lands, this provided an additional level of safety from more hostile tribes around them. Now, many critics will bring up the Pequot War of 1637 and paint it as a genocidal act against the natives, but to do so is sorely and often knowingly inaccurate. The truth is, as with every other war, far more complex. Unlike what your postmodernist history instructors would like to tell you, this war was not a racially charged war and would not be fought along racial lines. Tribes like the Mohegans would march alongside the Puritans, while tribes like the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts would support their efforts against the Pequots. In fact, the Pequots, whose name means destroyers in the Algonquian language, were portrayed by the surrounding native tribes as invaders, having migrated to the region months to only a couple of years before the Pilgrims had arrived. And by 1620, they had tyrannically dominated many other tribes in the region and had a considerable amount of power. In an act of revolt, these subjugated tribes would often side with the Puritans in opposition. The lead up to the war was certainly more complex. The Puritans most definitely did not just wake up one morning and decide they wanted to decimate this Pequot tribe. In fact, the Bay Colony even signed a treaty with the Pequots in 1634, but the Puritans would claim that the Pequots were not honoring the treaty's terms and have gone back on the willingness to trade. When the colony found that the Pequots harbored the native who murdered John Oldman, war was officially declared. John Endicott would lead ships to Block Island to destroy storehouses and cornfields, but minimize the casualties, allowing the natives to retreat and go into hiding. Subsequently, Puritans and tribal allies would march towards Pequot territory, where negotiations would dissolve and hostilities would rise. Some English were tortured and killed, and the Puritans and Mohegans would respond in kind. Now, not even all Puritans involved in the war agreed with the expedition at hand. In fact, Plymouth, Connecticut, and Fort Saybrook condemned the expedition outright, arguing that arrogance and aggression would be followed by retaliation. Eventually, the Connecticut colony would have enough and joined the offensive when the Pequots committed atrocities against their own men. This war would sadly end in a massacre where the English, Mohegans, and Narragansetts surrounded the Pequots as the mystic fort burned. Any escapees were shot and plenty of friendly fire was exchanged. After the war had finished, the remaining Pequots became subject to the tribes they once subjugated, and this would be the last large-scale war fought between the natives and Puritans until much later, during King Philip's War of 1689. Importantly, the Pequot War was distinctly not a racial war and had no involvement of the Plymouth colony whatsoever. Even amongst the native tribes, they did not think of themselves as being one singular race, but rather many different people groups. And more importantly, the Puritans did not think of the Indians to be a different race, but rather tan-skinned whites, much like Italians or Greeks. Their prevailing belief, in fact, was that the Indians descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and that their tan features had been a result of the sun and harsh elements. From this, there are almost no accounts whatsoever of racist beliefs or actions against the tribes during the 17th century, and certainly they did not look at themselves as being racially superior in any capacity. Where they ended up disagreeing was religion more than anything else. Puritan attempts to convert the tribes around them were largely unsuccessful, but this did not end in aggression. Their goal was to integrate and convert, not to conquer and enslave. John Eliot would even take up the task of translating the Bible into Algonquian, a task so demanding it required Eliot to first create a written lexicon of Algonquian, as one did not previously exist. Even in law, the Puritans treated the Indians as fairly as possible, even in court cases, allowing natives to take part in the jury. However, due to language barriers, this would largely be relegated to intertribal disputes. At times, the Puritan officials would even execute their own settlers for the unjust killing of an Indian, not believing themselves to be superior in any capacity. They would punish Englishmen for abuses against Indians, they took Indian testimony as equal to their own, and applied laws equally amongst all inhabitants while having had no law against intermarriage between the two, though there's really no evidence to support that that ever actually happened in the first place. In fact, the only records of selling off slaves to the West Indies were exceedingly infrequent and reserved in their codex as a punishment for repeat offenders of only the most heinous of crimes. This, too, was not reserved for natives alone, but applied equally to their own kind. It was seen as a last-ditch solution for only the most terrible of criminals. Now, while we may look at certain regulations on the amount of alcohol and firearms that the Bay Colony would allow the Indians to purchase as potentially being overbearing, many tribes like the Mohegans and Wampanoags reportedly preferred Puritan rule, reporting the Puritans to be better at peaceful resolutions of conflicts and contributing to the overall decline of violent actions in New England as a whole. What led to the drastic diminishing of the Indian tribes is very complicated, with disease likely being the largest contributor. The Indians didn't just hand New England over to the Puritans, but were also not removed by force or victims of genocide. While there's no doubt that Europeans in other parts of the New World, and even in other parts of North America, were responsible for enslaving the native populations and committing genocide, especially in Spanish territories if you're being intellectually honest with yourself, and the much later Trail of Tears is no laughing matter at all. But none of these are the fault of the Puritans. In 1633, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Thanksgiving Proclamation, which states that the last Thursday of each November be reserved as a day of Thanksgiving, and goes as such. Washington, D.C., October 3rd, 1863. By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. The year that is drawing towards its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added, which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart which is habitually insensible to the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and to provoke their aggression, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. Needful diversions of wealth and of strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plows, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines, as well of iron and coal as the precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy. It has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged, as with one heart and one voice by the whole American people. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as the day of thanksgiving and praise to our most beneficent Father, who dwelleth in the heavens. And I recommend to them that while offering up the ascriptions justly due to him for such singular deliverances and blessings, they do also, with humble penitence, for our national perverseness and disobedience, commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in this lamentable civil strife, in which we are unavoidably engaged, and fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty Hand to heal the wounds of the nation and restore it as soon as may be consistent with the divine purposes to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union. In testimony whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed, done at the city of Washington, this 3rd day of October, in the year of our Lord 1863, and of the independence of the United States the 88th, by the President Abraham Lincoln, as drafted by William H. Seward, Secretary of State. It is extremely popular today to point the finger for all of the world's ills at white Christians more than any other group. But don't take my word for it. The 1619 Project, the idea of critical race theory, and the modern education system at all levels is proof positive enough. However, we often want to project these horrible ideas back onto the Pilgrims of Plymouth and the Puritans of New England when they were nowhere close to being the monsters your postmodernist schools would make them out to be. The first Thanksgiving is not a blood-red stain on the history of America. It's a time where imperfect people from different lifestyles, with vastly different religious beliefs, would come together in harmony and give thanks for their hard work, and pray for their continued survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. It is a perfect example of people from vastly different racial and cultural backgrounds setting aside all differences to come together and share a meal. The first Thanksgiving is, after all, the essence of every single Thanksgiving.